Und dann geht's los. Viel Vergnügen.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first distinguished lecture of the Bavarian Research Network ForDaySec that deals with IT security aspects of our daily lives. My name is Stefan Katzenbeißer. I'm the speaker of this network, and it's nice to have you all here today. The network connects researchers from 5 different Bavarian universities that work in an interdisciplinary manner on various IT security topics that are relevant for our daily life. And within this distinguished lecture series, we will invite about 4 times a year outstanding researchers to give a lecture on a topic that is somehow related to the topics that we work on in our research network. And it's my pleasure to welcome Bart Preneel for our inaugural lecture. Professor Preneel is, I would say, the most well-known cryptographer in Europe. So he has worked on many different areas in cryptography, starting from hash functions over encryption algorithms, but also to topics like privacy. And he was also the president of the International Association for Cryptologic Research. And today he will talk about post-quantum cryptography, so a topic that is relevant for all of us. So as you may know, once quantum computers are available, then almost all public key cryptography that we know so far will get insecure. And of course, it's time to find alternatives, and it's time to do research so that we have alternatives once this quantum innovation comes to the market. And I'm excited to hear more about this very important timely topic. So Bart, the floor is yours. Thanks for coming.
Let's get started. Does this work? Okay. So good afternoon, and it's a great honor and pleasure to be here. And I want to apologize for not making it in person, but I definitely promise to make it up at some future occasion. So today I will talk from a distant and cold Leuven on post-quantum cryptography, and it's a challenge actually for 33. You will see later in the use this year. And in general, this is of course a time very far away from now. And if you talk to the average person in their daily life or the average person in industry, they don't care too much about what will happen in 10 years. But so I hope with this talk I can convince you we should actually start worrying about this, about the long term. And also, in fact, I want to point out there are solutions to the problems and challenges. So I did a rough count how many cryptographic devices there are, and there is actually a huge number of them. When I started in cryptography more than 30 years ago, there were probably only a few 100,000 over the whole world in some government agencies used by the military and some banks. But today I count something like 90 billion crypto devices. If you also count libraries on your smartphone and identity cards, access cards, and so on. So those are not all on the internet. The number of devices on the internet is much smaller, but total number of devices that use cryptography is about 90 billion. And if you take a crypto course, you will always hear about Alice and Bob protecting themselves against Eve. It turns out that in fact 2/3 of the cryptography is used to protect companies and governments against Alice and Bob. So very often cryptography is used to actually protect the interests of industry, like your bank card or your access card, or the update system on your mobile devices, or if you still have DVD or Blu-ray players, digital content players, PlayStations and gaming devices, passports, identity cards. We have them now at the scale of billions, but in general, as a user, we don't have much control. And these devices are there to actually give the organizations access or control over our assets. There is, of course, still quite some devices we have to protect Alice and Bob. My count is about 30 billion, of which the largest one is mobile phone system, where you have encrypted calls, but not end-to-end. So even in your most advanced 5G system, if you use a call, it's encrypted till the base station controller, and it goes actually unencrypted over the fixed network. Then you have a TLS ecosystem. It's also huge, with hundreds of millions of servers and billions of devices. Although we are aware that it's quite easy to intercept TLS by issuing fake certificates, and there is also some companies offering services to do this. We have quite strong encryption on our mobile devices. Probably the strongest encryption there is the one on our mobile phones. Then we have also decent protection on chat applications, in particular things like WhatsApp or Signal. Although there we have to, of course, understand that in applications like WhatsApp, the metadata is not protected. Then there is many more. Overall, I think it's an amazing success. And so even if we probably don't protect users as much as we want to, we protect mostly industry, it's still an amazing success. If you look at something like a bit more than 3 decades, we went from a few 100,000 devices to something like 90 billion devices or libraries or applications that use cryptography. Now, market product. And so as we will see, this cryptography is in part under threat. And so the task is now in the next 10 years to replace a large part of this by new cryptography. And so definitely this is an amazing challenge because changing cryptography, as we learned from the past, is quite hard. So we'll say a few things about quantum computers and the impact on cryptography. Then we'll see what the community has done to deal with this. And we look at what the challenges will be in making this conversion to new cryptography that takes into account the existence of quantum computers, and then we'll look at the migration issues. So, but more than 40 years ago, 2 physicists independently formulated the idea of building quantum computers, Yuri Manin in Russia and at that time Soviet Union, and Richard Feynman in the US. And so their idea was to build computers that would operate according to the principles of quantum physics, where you have not bits that are 0 and 1, but you have bits or states or elements that are in a superposition of 0 and 1 that are somehow 0 and 1 at the same time to perform computations with those computers. So of course, if every bit in your computer can take at the same time 0 and 1, then even if you have a modest number of bits, you certainly can do many more calculations at once. So their vision was that these computers would be much more powerful, and they wanted to use those computers to study physical and chemical processes, because as we know, at a very small scale, nature behaves quantum mechanically, governed by very complex equations, and studying these classical computers is very challenging. It goes beyond the capability, especially for complex systems. So their idea was, why don't we build a computer that works based on quantum physics principles so we can actually study quantum physics? And people actually started doing this. And one data point is that about 10 years ago, the NSA already spent something like $85 million on research to build such a computer. So there must have been interest in many governments to do this. We'll see later on why. But so in the first few, people built very small quantum computers with 1 or 2 or maybe at most 7 qubits and very few gates. So they were a bit like the toy computers. They were a bit like what happened in the 1940s in Bell Labs, when people built the first logic gates and the first transistors and trying to experiment with the first things. And we know that it took until 50s and 60s to build mainframe computers, and then the 70s to build microcomputers. So not very spectacular. What's interesting is that there is many different technologies, and the biggest one was a 7-bit computer. We'll come back to that later. So fast forward 2 decades, and you see that now we have actually several organizations. IBM is one of the leading ones, but also Google, Intel, USTC, China, and there is many more companies like Rigetti that are building ever larger quantum computers. And so if you look at the roadmap, there is actually only one company producing a roadmap, which is IBM. So IBM has a roadmap, as you can see, that goes for the next few years. So at this moment, IBM actually has this Osprey computer in 2022, which has 443 qubits. Although this computer officially exists already for a year, nobody has seen the specifications or the details, and it has not been made available. But the one, the Eagle, there is quite some details on this. This is from 2021, has 127 qubits. But so IBM promises for this year more than 1,000 qubits. For 2024, 1,400 qubits. For 2025, 4,000 qubits. And then for 2026 and later, they promise us many qubits, 10,000 to more, but then they actually become very vague. So it's interesting to see that only IBM produces a roadmap, and you can see that even if the roadmap is only a few years old, they're already behind, because apparently there is still no formal description and announcement of the details of this Osprey computer, which was supposed to see the daylight last year. Now, when people look at quantum computers, they always look at qubits, but this is very misleading because you actually have to look also at what the error rate is and also how long this computer actually stays working. So in fact, it's very naive and very simplistic to only look at qubits, but that's something what humans do. We try to reduce things to a single parameter, which we can understand, but in fact, the space is much more complex. So now why do we care so much, and especially cryptographers? Because about 10 years after the invention of quantum computers, the concept, Peter Shor actually found out that you can do more with these computers than just predict physical processes. You can actually solve number theoretic problems like factoring and discrete log. And so it turns out that if we look at these 90 billion cryptographic devices, about half of them use these algorithms called public key cryptography, where you have one key, a private key to decrypt and a public key to encrypt, or a private key to sign and a public key to verify. So this is about half the applications. For example, all code updates, all secure channels set up on the web over SSH, over IPsec, all these use public key cryptography. And so Peter Shor showed that even if you can build a moderately sized quantum computer, you can actually factor a moduli of several thousand bits, so break RSA or break Diffie-Hellman as we use it today on the web. So quite dramatic, and of course this simulated quite some research into quantum computers because they would now be useful for more things than just predicting physical and quantum chemical or processes. They would actually now be used to break cryptography. So the algorithm that Peter Shor proposed is a very simple algorithm. If you're familiar with signal processing, it's just a fast Fourier transform. So it's more or less n log n. And so today the standard on the internet is RSA 2048. And to break that, you would need a few thousand qubits only. Now this is actually logical qubits. So if you look at the qubits from the previous slide, these are physical qubits. And it turns out that, in fact, those qubits are very noisy. And the current estimate, but this is really just a guesstimate, is that to build 4,000 noise-free logical qubits, you would need something like 20 million physical qubits. So it's not the case that we're very close and that IBM can do it in 2 years. So if you look at the predictions and the speed at which things go ahead, 10 to 20 more years before we can reach these 20 million qubits. In fact, this was the drive, this factoring algorithm was the drive to build the first 7-qubit computer, was built in Stanford based on a chemical molecule and by 2 PhD students who programmed the computer, and there were several people at IBM who actually did the chemistry to build the computer itself, the hardware. And so after a large team worked for several years, they managed to factor the number 15 and show it was 5 times 3. This is the achievement of factorization on a quantum computer. There was a bit of cheating involved. They actually used a special structure of the number 15 to make the factorization faster. So some people even argue that this was not really the factorization of a real full factorization algorithm. And then another development a few years later, Love Grover actually showed that with quantum computers you can actually speed up symmetric key search, so break AES, for example, in times square root of a normal size. So if you have a room with, say, 20 seats per row and 20 rows, there is 400 people. With a quantum computer, you could find out where a person is sitting even by looking only at one row or one column. So you only look at 20 places and still you can determine in which of the 400 places somebody is sitting. So this is seen of kind of counterintuitive and magical, and this is magical. So this means that if you have AES with a 128-bit key, searching for such a key would normally take 2 to the 128 operations. On a quantum computer, it would only take 2 to the 64 operations, square root of 2 to the 128. So this seems like quite dramatic. There is points to be made. First, in symmetric cryptography, it's quite easy to double your key length. And there is a reason why the AES algorithm also has a 256-bit key length. So if you worry about these attacks, you can just use AES 256, which has 40% more rounds and twice as large key, and then you don't have to worry anymore about quantum computers. The second point is that this algorithm actually is not parallelizable and requires a huge computer with something like 270 gates. So in fact, most experts agree that yes, there is a threat. People will be able to build this 20 million qubits. This is something like 2 to the 24 or so, but 2 to the 70 qubits, this is still very far away. And maybe for symmetric cryptography, we shouldn't worry too much about this Grover attack. But there is a problem. If people make progress, researchers make progress, then actually about half of the cryptography that we use today, which means all cryptography for secure update, secure communication on the web, but also in Skype, in WhatsApp, in SSH, and so on, would all be broken. Also the technology used in passports and identity cards, and in the credit cards, which actually be vulnerable. To go a bit more in detail, here you see a graph which gives you a bit of perspective on where we are. What you see in the x-axis is number of qubits in an exponential scale or log scale, and on the y-axis the error rate. And so all these great developments that took us something like 40 years to get there since the first paper by Feynman and Manin, so we more or less stay in this few hundred gates and error rates of the order of 1 in 100 to 1 in 500. Once we enter the blue zone, quantum error correction can work, and so we can actually build noise-free bits out of noisy bits. If you look at the yellow zone, this actually indicates where things we can do anywhere on classical computers. So there, in fact, quantum computers give no real advantage, because in this zone we can simulate things also on our most powerful computers. At the upper level here in green, you see what would be needed for quantum chemistry. You see you're still quite far away from this. Error rate reductions by a factor something like 1,000. And then RSA is in the upper right of this diagram. So as you see, we're still very far away. In spite of 40 years of research, we're quite far away from breaking RSA, even 1024 or 2048. So the question is, can this now be done, and how long will it take before we get there? And I guess this is a very good question. It's $1 million question. Now, we don't know the answer to this question, but we know that actually 8 years ago, the NSA got very nervous, because the NSA has been selling for years to their allies, so especially in NATO. They've been selling, look, what we recommend as standard today is elliptic curve cryptography with AES cipher. And so they were telling all the NATO allies, throw out your current cryptographic equipment and install Suite B, because this is the future standard. And 8 years ago, NSA issued a statement saying that, well, we actually don't think this is secure because of the threat by quantum computers. And so please, if you haven't migrated to Suite B, stop doing this. So you can imagine that many member states of NATO were very upset because the Americans kept selling them Suite B. And so they said, oh, in fact, you can throw this stuff out because it's no good. Wait, we'll come with something else. So they say, we will initiate a transition to quantum resistant algorithms in the not too distant future. As we will see, this will be, what they mean by this is within 10 years. So it's not actually not so nearby. And so, as I said, if you actually haven't used Suite B yet or haven't transferred, you can as well keep your old stuff. And in fact, they also pointed out that if you want to keep RSA and if discrete log, then use 3072 bits rather than 2048 or 124 bits. So this is really a very big question, is when will these computers be built, especially the ones which are powerful enough to break RSA? And we have to be very careful, because guys in physics, they've done amazing stuff, right? They built us a transistor in the 40s. People would have said, you know, by 2020, we will put several billion transistors on a chip of a few square millimeters. People would have laughed, and they wouldn't have believed that in something like 60 or 70 years, something you can barely build in silicon, you can certainly put billions and billions on a small chip. On the other hand, you also have the guys in fusion who keep promising us that they will do fusion and realize fusion, even cold fusion, and they always ask for billions more, and then they always put the goal 10 years. And so the question is, what is it? It's very dangerous to make a gamble here, but this is here what experts say, and I have to be careful here because, of course, many of these experts are people who receive funding to do research in this area, so they may be a bit biased, and they may not be so keen to tell their funders, in fact, we're never going to get there. So this you have to take into account, but let's go to 15 years. So if you look at 15 years ahead, if you ask a bunch of experts, 22 experts, and more or less half of them say it's more than 50% chance it will be such a computer, and the other half says it's less than 50% chance. On the other hand, if you go 30 years away, they all think the probability is more than 50%. So the other thing which you should be very careful is that these first computers from Google and IBM, they use they're quite bulky, and they use things like ion traps and NMR effects, and so they're hard to make small. But at this moment, there is also several startups that build quantum dots, actually, where a quantum qubit is actually the size of the individual transistor. Guys have roadmaps where they say, okay, we now have only 6. It's very hard to control them because we have to control spin of molecules or atoms. But in fact, we have a realistic roadmap to build 1 million of those within 10 years on a chip. And of course, this is more realistic because we know how to scale silicon. So I think it's kind of dangerous to think it will not happen. That'd be my statement. We'll look later what the implications are. Of course, Ali Shamir, who is a bit biased on the other side because he's the S in RSA, he actually says, well, you can do other things. For 30 years, this will not work. Don't invest your time in quantum computers, or don't worry about post-quantum cryptography. RSA is good for 30 years or more. So this is what is made as a statement. But I think in general, people agree that we really can't take the risk. And I'll come back to more details for this. So it may well be that these guys will fail, but we can't take the risk. So we should go to post-quantum cryptography. And there we actually use new mathematics based on lattices. This is, as we will see, there are several schemes that use a different kind of mathematics. It's actually some clever linear algebra with noise. And this is lattice-based cryptography. It's not so new. You can argue that the knapsack-based systems from the late 70s, early 80s were also lattice-based, or at least they were broken using lattices and they use similar techniques. But it seems we now better understand this. So I think as a society, we probably cannot afford to not invest in those things. On the other hand, there is also the other side of the coin. Quantum physicists have trying to sell us QKD, which means use quantum physics to do key exchange. And this is more or less not working. I mean, it works, but it's very low bit rates, very small distances, very expensive equipment. And what you see is now that, well, the US built a prototype, and then Europe invested it because the US did it, and China built a prototype and a large-scale network because Europe did it, and now Europe is doing it again because China does it. But if you ask really what are the applications, it's very, very niche because as long as we have no quantum repeaters, we actually point-to-point connections which are not very useful for most of our daily needs. But nevertheless, Europe has decided to spend 100 million euros on it. The Space Agency is spending the same amount of it, and many member states, against the advice of cryptographers and against the advice of GCHQ, ANSI, and BSI, are still investing in lots of money because, again, it sounds very cool. It's cool research, but it's not going to solve any problems in the next 20 to 30 years. So imagine that you've decided now, well, we can't really afford, given we have so much digital data, our economy is now digital for something like 15%, and probably in the next decade it will become about 30% digital, will double. We can't really afford to have all these crypto devices, and half of them, those based on public key cryptography, being broken, so somewhere in the next 20 or 30 years. So we now do some mathematics. We have Moscas formula. So you just make a guess how long it will take until the first large quantum computer will be built. That can be 5 years, can be 10 years. If you're pessimistic, you put 30 years. Then you have to estimate how long it will take to switch. So how long does it take you to take those something like 50 billion devices and upgrade them all? And for some, it's very easy. On a mobile phone, you can all give an update of WhatsApp and suddenly it uses post-quantum cryptography. But if you think of cars or garage door openers or your dishwasher and all these other things, it may be much harder to actually update them. And to give you an idea of the timeline, updating financial infrastructure is estimated to take about 15 to 20 years. So this is payment terminals. Unless, of course, everybody starts paying everything with smartphones and the merchants also move to smartphones. If you look at all those terminals and ATM machines, if you want to upgrade those, that takes about 15 to 20 years. And then, of course, the other question is, how long does your data need to be confidential? And for standard business practices, it's 5 to 10 years. Of course, for our medical data, which is 50 to 100 years. And if you're a government, and there's very often governments do things which are maybe not so legal, or they don't want to see the daylight. So the standard period for government secrets is 50 years. And sometimes, and even today, there is know-how from World War II, which we're still not allowed to know. So apparently, the period can be even longer. Okay, so to Moscow's formula, you have to switch from RSA to post-quantum cryptography in the year 2023, plus Q minus X minus Y. So it's not very difficult mathematics. So in 2023 plus Q, there is a quantum computer. You have to start switching X years before, and you have to take Y years of margin because you want your data to be confidential. So you have to understand that if today, if you send ciphertext, the NSA will try to break it. If they can't break it, they send it to Utah, where they store it in case in the future they can break it. And if you read the Snowden documents, in fact, there is mass scale interception. So at all the, for example, all the contact points where transatlantic cables reach the ground, there is an interception station where the videos of the cats are filtered out, and then what remains is actually analyzed and stored. And as I said, it's decrypted and analyzed, and if it can be decrypted, it's stored in Utah, where there is a huge data center where all your communications will be stored until the NSA has a quantum computer. So just very simple, if I put Q17, so kind of a bit on the optimistic side still, I need 7 years to switch, which is also a bit optimistic, and I just have standard commercial security, then I have to actually switch in 2023. In fact, you should start switching or switch your cryptography away today. So you're already too late if you do it next year. And this is for 10 years security. For medical data, you should have actually switched your system 30 or 40 years ago. And so now you can understand why the NSA is so nervous. Because for the NSA, Y is 50. And so if the NSA applies Moscow's formula, they get very nervous. They should actually have switched it already 30 years ago. So they feel they're very late and they're worried. So here's a bit more spelled out. So more or less, at this moment, the standards are being finalized with the final details. The standard will be published next year. Then implementers can start. These implementations have to be validated, and then you have to roll them out till several years. So in fact, if you manage to do it by 2030, that's already quite an achievement. So I think in many businesses, it will take about 10 years. So this explains the title of my talk. Will you be ready by 2033? And then your data will be intercepted still just before you switch. And so again, you have to hope that by 2040, the NSA doesn't have a quantum computer yet, because then they can still read all your data, which was supposed to be secure for 10 years. So this is the most difficult mathematics we do today. So just a simple sum, but it shows you, in fact, we are already, you can understand why the NSA is in panic, why most governments are very worried. On the other hand, the rest of the industry, as we will see, the companies that are worried is the financial sector and the automotive sector, because the financial sector, because they're regulated, the regulators are saying you should do something. Automotive sector, because if you work on the design of a car today, it may take 3 to 4 years or 5 years before this car is on the road. And hopefully, if you did a good job, this car will be driving for 25 years. So now you can understand why the automotive industry is also worried, because they also look ahead and they want to have a car in 20 years that cannot be hacked. So they actually should also start switching. However, if you go to the average IT company and you tell them there will be a problem in 2040 with somebody will read your data, and so you have to be ready by 2030 and start investing millions of euros in the next decade to hire people and change all your millions of crypto devices, they will look at you and say, I will be retired by 2030. Or I will be working for a different company, or I will have a different job. Why should I now invest money for a problem that will only manifest itself in 17 years from now? And anyway, this is a huge project that will take me 7 to 10 years. And why should I now start investing in this? A normal company, if you get somebody telling you this story, the safe story is to send them away and say, not my problem. Somebody else will be sitting in this seat and they will get the problem when it arrives. They will solve the problem. Of course, if you look at authentication only, there the situation is a bit better for updates and also for signatures. In principle, or for blockchain, in principle, the day before the computer is operational, you could re-sign everything and make a new blockchain or make a new code update or make new signatures. On the other hand, of course, that sounds very good. In practice, of course, that means also that all the devices have to verify those signatures and so on. So even Y is 0, you still would need to start well on time. And so it's not so easy to do these things overnight. Probably also Y is a couple of years as well, just because you can't change things overnight. Of course, we actually don't change things overnight. We've been working on this for a long time. The first conference on what we call post-quantum cryptography was held in Leuven, something like 20 years ago, called PQ Crypto. And of course, immediately after Peter Shor's paper in the 90s, there was some research. So the first academic conference was about 20 years ago. And then 7 years ago, NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technologies in the US, started a competition. This is what cryptographers do. When you need a new algorithm, we organize a competition. It's like the Olympic Games for cryptographers. So everybody can participate and you can become very famous. You don't become very rich because very often the rules of the competition are that you should actually give away all your intellectual property right. And so you get the honor of winning, you get a nice plaque from NIST, but that's what you get. And of course, you'll probably be a bit famous as well. So this competition took quite a long time, so 6 years, as we will see. The final report was published last year, and as we will see also, in fact, the competition is still ongoing. So it ended and it's still ongoing at the same time. It's a bit like a quantum state, but we will see the details. So an important number here was at the bottom. There were 82 submissions, of which about a third made it to the second phase, 7 to the last phase. In the end, 4 winners were selected. There were actually, lapis-based was dominant, 28 schemes, and in the end, 3 lapis-based winners. Code-based schemes, quite important as well as many, but it turns out that none of those became winners. So at this moment, none of the code-based schemes, which go back to McAleese from the 70s, were winning. Multivariate, there many got broken, and again, there were no winners. And there is some hash-based signatures. They're actually quite well understood. They're also schemes from the 70s. But they had some efficiency concerns, but their one was finally selected, and people proposed many other wild ideas, and nothing came out of this. So more or less, the outcome of this competition is you ask the world what to do, you get 82 schemes, and they say these schemes will last for 50 years or more. It turns out that half of those schemes were broken within a few years. So there was not such a good outcome, but then there was quite some effort to look at the existing schemes, and so we ended up now with mostly lapis-based schemes. 2 signature schemes, 1 encryption scheme, and then 1 hash-based signature, which is an improved variant of a scheme from the 70s. And I mean, there's also 2 other lattice-based schemes that were standardized by IETF. I'll come back to the difference later. So this is the outcome. And as you can imagine, NIST is happy there is something, but they're not so happy with the diversity. So NIST was hoping to have a lapis-based scheme, a code-based scheme, maybe a multivariate scheme, and maybe something else to have a bit more diversity. It turns out that we have all our eggs are now in the basket of lattices. A bit more detail. So there is 2 signature schemes, Dilithium and Falcon, and 1 encryption scheme, Kyber. There were many very similar encryption schemes in the competition, like Saber from KU Leuven, NTRU from Bernstein and others, or NTU Prime, sorry, NTRU, which was an older scheme, and then ForDaySec, which is a less structured lattice, so it's slightly less efficient. It has bigger keys, but probably also less risk for attacks. So for hash-based, there is only Sphinx remaining. So code-based, there is classic McAleese, which has a huge key. And then there is some more efficient schemes like Bike and HQC, but they were not selected. There were 2 multivariate schemes in the final round, GEMS and Rainbow. GEMS was broken, and then other schemes, signature scheme Picnic, and then the encryption scheme Psych. So as you see, NIST shows the schemes proposed by mostly the main submitter was Vadim Nubashevsky, Dilithium, Falcon, and Kyber. So he was at that time working for IBM. And so the scheme of Leuven, KU Leuven, you may know that AES was designed by people from KU Leuven, and SHA-3 was designed by Johan Damen, who got his PhD from our group. But so it was decided the third time they shouldn't take Saber from KU Leuven, which was a bad decision because we got so upset that then we broke 2 of their finalists in 2022. So in fact, Wouter Cassec and Thomas de Cru broke Cyc, which was seen as the most promising alternative to Kyber, which has very short transmissions. And then the lattice-based scheme, the multivariate-based scheme Rainbow was also a finalist, which was also broken by White Berlins. So both schemes were broken actually in an hour on a weekend on a laptop. So they were actually shown not to be very secure. So in fact, those schemes fell out. And so this now shows that really the choice is lattice-based, hash-based, and in code-based there is still some uncertainty, but all the rest is actually no longer available. Maybe also interesting to note that actually ForDaySec, which is the less efficient version of Kyber, which has bigger keys and more computation, so it does use less mathematical structure in the matrix, because lattice-based schemes are linear algebra, they're based on large matrix. And to make them efficient, you put structure in the matrix. So if you put less structure in the matrix, you can less efficient, but BSI and ANSI like it. And classic Macaleese, which has a huge key, BSI also likes it, but NIST doesn't want it. So there seems to be some divergence across the Atlantic. I will not spend too much time on the security levels. There is still some debate about this, how you actually measure quantum security. And this debate is still ongoing. Of course, you can count gates, but then how do you count memory accesses? And if you want to find out more, you can actually subscribe to the NIST post-quantum mailing list, and you can see endless complex discussions on how you measure complexity, especially in these ranges above 2 to the 120. There's quite some debates on what are realistic cost measures or not. So the good news is that actually not much changes if you want to implement those algorithms in terms of you have for the key generation encryption and decryption for the encryption, and you have key generation signing and verification for the signature. So somehow it's the API is plug and play. But here you see the big difference. This is for encryption. On the x-axis, you see public key size, and on the y-axis, you see ciphertext size. And so the most widely scheme today is ECC at the bottom left here, where it's about something like 60 to 80 bytes for public key and ciphertext. RSA is like 256 bytes. The lattice-based schemes are here, so you see that you have keys of kilobytes and ciphertext of kilobytes. And now you may understand why only Germany likes Macaleese. Macaleese has keys of several hundred kilobytes. But quite complex ciphertext sizes. But this is, of course, completely out of order. And ForDaySec, this is an unstructured lattice. This sits here. This is, again, 4 to 8 kilobytes of ciphertext and keys. Again, this is something that you worry about or you want to accept if you really don't want any weaknesses, but of course, it's very expensive. In terms of performance, I'll give you the slides later, so I will not spend too much time. These are initial numbers done by Cloudflare. The good news is, in fact, here speeds are encryption or encapsulation decryptions per second. In fact, it's faster than elliptic curves. So actually, people are worried that these post-quantum schemes will be slower, but in fact, they're faster. Of course, you can't beat RSA encryption with small exponent. This is still faster, but actually, it's faster than elliptic curves and by a good margin. On the other hand, of course, your keys, as I pointed out, and ciphertext are much bigger. And this is especially a problem for applications like smart cards or small devices, or you want to do a contactless payment where you want to hold your card a tenth of a second above a reader. Well, this tenth of a second where RSA is being used will now become 3 times longer, so all shopping will be slowed down. So this is clearly not acceptable with the current technology. So Kyber is fine, just large key sizes. And this is looking at alternatives. Why? Not because they don't like Kyber, but because they don't like everything to depend on lattices. And so they're looking at code-based schemes. Macaleese is highly inefficient, and the others, Bike, had the potential to be more efficient, but then the key sizes are similar as Kyber. And some people, of course, have some doubts whether it's wise to use structured codes, and we should actually not use Macaleese, but this is still for debate. So in fact, to sort out this debate, NIST has extended the competition. So I showed you there were 3 rounds, and then the 4 winners were chosen. Now there is a 4th round for encryption, in which NIST is still looking at those final schemes. So they're comparing the ones I showed here, classic Macaleese, Spike, and HQC, because Cyc no longer is there. So they're looking at this and to deciding whether one of those schemes will be chosen as an extra solution. For signatures, the situation is comparable in the sense that at least Dilithium and Falcon are faster in signing, not Sphinx. But of course, the signatures are now huge. So in verification, everything is faster, although it's hard to beat RSA with small exponent. But of course, compared to elliptic curve, in fact, again, we gain in speed except with Sphinx. But we pay an enormous price. Signatures and public keys become larger. And so if you look at a certificate, for example, a signed certificate, there is a public key and a signature. And so as you see, so you have to have the sum of both. And so this is blowing up by a huge factor. So again, for many applications, a big challenge. Also, Sphinx, the signature becomes huge. Public key is small, but the signatures are huge. It's okay if you sign a code update of several megabytes. It's not okay if you sign a bank transaction of 30 or 40 bytes to have suddenly a 17 kilobyte signature. So people do like these liveness-based schemes. They're quite efficient, but large sizes. Lithium is simple. Falcon is very complicated. It saves a bit in signature size at the cost of using floating point arithmetic. And the submitters have apologized for having such a complex scheme. NIST has admitted that they released the draft standards for Kyber, Dilithium, and Sphinx Plus, but for Falcon, they're still trying to fully understand the scheme. So it's kind of amazing. There is a 6-year competition, and that says we will choose Falcon as a winner, but we actually don't understand quite well how it works. So this is kind of a bad sign, I would say, and I really wonder whether anybody is ever going to deploy Falcon. So you can't check it on a smart card because it uses floating arithmetic, and it seems to be a very messy scheme. But so, of course, the reason why people may want to use it is the signature is 4 times smaller and comes in the neighborhood of an RSA signature. And if you have floating point, you're very good, but I still think it will be very hard to implement securely. Final category is hash-based signatures. So there is Sphinx. It's stateless, which means you can keep signing messages based on a random number, while the IETF schemes, which are much more efficient, they're actually stateful. So there, if you actually sign the same message, if you sign with the same key twice, you compromise your full key and you lose all your security. So it's kind of a foot cannon. If you misuse this scheme, you actually have serious problems. So Sphinx doesn't have this problem, but you pay for this in a very high price in terms of performance. And especially in cloud environments, it seems to be very hard to use these stateful schemes because their containers are shut down and brought up again, and there is replication and so on. So in those kind of environments, you really would like to have stateless schemes. So NIST is not happy with the current signatures because they can't describe Falcon properly. They only have Dilithium. So they actually have not a fortran, but a new competition. So they actually called for new schemes by last 40 candidates, and they're now starting a new competition. So if you can still follow, there was first a competition which was extended, and then there was also a parallel new competition was started at the end. So if you're confused, well, I am too. There is some benchmarking links here we can look at. There is, for example, the SuperCup benchmarking, there is the PQC clean, and there is on GitHub also a Cortex M4 benchmark. Again, this is academic benchmark, it's not commercial products. So here is an attempt to clarify the situation. So the competition started 7 years ago. July 22, 4 winners were announced, but then new signature schemes were submitted by June this year. 40 were received, and then another round 4 was started in which Psych was eliminated, and after a few weeks, and then actually 3 schemes are remaining. So in 2024, round 4 will probably end, and then by 2025 or 2026, the signatures will be selected. So there will be more signatures, signature and encryption drafts being released. So currently there is drafts out for Kyber, Dilithium, and Sphinx Plus, and they're still working on Falcon. And the goal is still to publish those standards next year, but then there will be more standards coming in 2025, 2026, 2027. So, of course, today we are so most people believe we'll go to a hybrid era where we will use post-quantum together with pre-quantum, and then afterwards we'll have actually a post-quantum era where we dump RSA and ECC. But in this hybrid phase, you have the choice between or and and. So you can, of course, sign with RSA and with Dilithium, and you can check one signature or the other, which means you can actually, you don't need to implement both, and you have a gradual transition. On the other hand, of course, if one is broken, then you're actually cooked. If you check both signatures, then you have long-term security, but of course, then you have to make sure that all your devices immediately understand the 2 signatures. And it's not so easy to change billions of devices at once. For encryption, if you do the OR, so if you encrypt the session key with RSA or ECC and with post-quantum separately, then in the future, if RSA is broken, all your security is lost. You can, of course, encrypt your session key first with RSA or ECC and then with post-quantum, and then you keep long-term security. But then, of course, again, it assumes that your recipient already is upgraded as well. So you have to somehow upgrade at once. So it's unclear whether this will work in all kinds of circumstances. So this is a very tough choice to make. And certificates is going to become very messy because you have a chain of certificates, and maybe some are OR and some are AND, and you can see there will be quite some complexity. So I think it will be very challenging, in particular, as I mentioned, for certificates. So NSA published last year their plan, very interesting, no Falcon. So they keep using AES and SHA, the higher versions. They use the stateful signature, so no Sphinx, but LMS and XMSS. They use Kybers and Dilithium and no Falcon, and only the high security level, not the lower security levels. And then they make a transition. You can see they want everything to be done, and all the RSA and ECC were kicked out by 2033. So now this explains my talk. So more or less the NSA says for some applications you get a bit more time, but software updates we want to start in 2025. And remember, the standard will only be published in 2024, which is amazing, but you can do it so fast. But the most surprising is the NSA said no hybrid modes. So they don't want this combination and or they just say dump all the RSA and ECC and we go immediately to the post-quantum algorithms, which I think many people still can't understand why they do it like this. And so they're very ambitious. They want everything to be upgraded in 10 years. It sounds like a long time, but until you start talking to your vendors and looking at certified solutions and testing your implementations and interoperability testing and so on, 10 years may sound a lot, but to upgrade millions or billions of devices, definitely the rest of the industry cannot follow this schedule. I'm seeing I'm running out of time, but of course what most companies have to do is first figuring out which cryptography they have and make sure this is all okay. I'm told that in the framework of these exercises, many banks find in their basement CAs somebody set up 20 years ago and they still keep running and nobody knew they existed and nobody knows who is in charge of them. Then, of course, you have to plan how to migrate, but also look at your supply chains, because it's all very nice to make a plan, but when will your suppliers deliver? And for example, I'm aware that the cloud providers, for example, are not at all very keen to migrate quickly, because for them it's $1 billion investment and the return is not so big. So of course, simplify things. And then I think the next thing people should think about is, well, even if you migrate to Dilithium or Kyber, think of what you will migrate to afterwards. Don't make the same mistake of RSA and ECC, where you roll things out and you thought there will never be a future. So I think if you have to think beyond your retirement or beyond your next job, maybe you should also think then for the long run and think about how you can upgrade the next version of political cryptography. That may be coming as well. Okay. Just as a wrap up, so look at the OWASP top 10. Cryptographic failures is number 2, but of course it doesn't say post-quantum weaknesses. It says no encryption being used or weak algorithms like A51 or the algorithm in DECT, default keys in the software and so on, bad randomness. So you can say, well, maybe cryptographic failures are important, but I don't see that for the short term the use of algorithms that don't resist quantum cryptography or quantum computing is a problem. On the other hand, if you look at all those 10 points in the OWASP top 10, I put some in red, and then let you guess why. Well, if you look at those red things in detail, in fact, all these solutions against these attacks rely somehow on public key cryptography. So in fact, if you want your countermeasures against the OWASP top 10 still work in 5 years from now, you should start now preparing for all those things. And so I guess that's more or less the message, that even if you don't see immediate impact and you have big fish to fry, you still have to start working on this. So time to wrap up. So it's kind of amazing because the research started more or less shortly after Peter Shor's paper in '94. Then the first conference took 10 years. Then it took 10 years to have a competition. The competition took 7 years, but it's still ongoing. So it will also take 10 years and the migration will take 10 years. So if you add it all up, it's a 40 years process. And this is kind of amazing because, 15 years ago, we just got the iPhone or the tablet. I mean, it's kind of, in modern internet scales, technologies roll out very, very quickly. But changing public key cryptography, it seems to be a 40-year process, and maybe even longer. There may be some patent problems, and some have been resolved by NIST, but I expect that more people are taking crazy patents, and this field will be a minefield of patents in the next decade. We have to deal with larger key ciphertext and signatures. Unfortunately, the schemes which we prefer best, like classic Megalese or ForDaySec or Sphinx, the more robust schemes, they actually are the least efficient schemes. So there is no free lunch here. Lattice-based schemes have a good performance. So there is still some debate ongoing on the size of the parameters and on implementation issues. So for example, lattice-based schemes can have decryption failures, which means you encrypt something and you can't decrypt. Now you can choose the parameters in such a way that this will not happen, but kind of there is debate and it's not always verifiable that these parameters have been well chosen and so on. So this is, people who implement cryptography have lots of challenges ahead, and also side channel resistant. This is something, to my amazement, had only very little attention during the NIST competition. For example, I saw a talk at Real World Crypto in March. People published one of the first fault attacks against dilithium. So if you look at signature schemes in smart cards, the first thing people worry about is fault attacks. Well, it turns out that 6 years in the competition after dilithium was chosen, nobody had even looked at the problem. How do we make implementation of dilithium secure against fault attacks? Which is a bit worrisome because it shows that the maturity of implementations is really not yet where we want to be. And so this justifies why it will probably take 10 years to migrate. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy, of course, to take questions.
Okay, so many thanks, Bart, for this nice presentation. We can take questions a bit later. For now, I want to remind you that there will be another lecture in this series. It's planned for April next year, and you can see the title here. It will be on cyber physical challenges for critical infrastructure in smart cities. And next time, the University of Erlangen Nuremberg will be the host, and it will again be live streamed. Thanks for coming, and